The rain had left the streets glistening like sheets of broken glass, reflecting the dim glow of street lamps and the occasional streak of a passing car. Daniel sat in his taxi, fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the sidewalk for potential passengers. It was late evening, the kind of quiet hour when the city seemed to exhale after a long, restless day. His mind wandered, as it often did, toward the weight of his own past, the losses that had carved deep spaces into his heart. Driving wasn't just his job, it was his refuge. Behind the wheel, he didn't have to explain himself or face questions, he simply moved people from one place to another, often in silence. But that night, silence broke in the most unexpected way. Ahead, by the iron gates of the cemetery, stood an elderly woman. She was small, almost swallowed by her oversized gray coat, her shoulders stooped beneath an invisible burden. In her hands, she held a bouquet of flowers, their petals drooping as if they too carried sorrow. She raised her hand with hesitation, flagging him down as though she wasn't sure anyone would stop. Daniel pulled over immediately. Something about the frail figure tugged at his heart, and instinct told him this wasn't just another passenger. The door creaked open, and the woman climbed in slowly, as if each movement required careful thought. Daniel caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, a face lined with years, eyes shimmering with a mixture of strength and sadness. He offered her a gentle smile, the kind he reserved for passengers who reminded him of someone familiar, someone dear. "Good evening, ma'am," he said softly. "Where to?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an entire life. She gave him an address across town. The moment the words left her lips, Daniel felt something shift inside him. His hands, steady for years through every storm and rush of traffic, froze on the wheel. His knuckles turned white as if the steering wheel itself had become a lifeline. The air in the cab seemed heavier, pressing against him. He knew that address, not just in passing, not like the countless streets and homes he had memorized in his career. This place lived inside him. The very mention of it pulled him backward in time, to days he rarely allowed himself to remember. It was the house where his late wife had grown up, the house he had avoided since her death, the house that symbolized everything he had loved and lost. He hadn't spoken of it in years, hadn't even allowed himself to drive past that part of town. And now, fate, or something greater, was forcing his hand. Daniel's throat tightened, and for a moment he didn't know if he could move. He glanced at the woman again in the mirror. She was looking out the window, unaware of his inner storm, her hands clasping the flowers tightly, as if afraid they might fall apart. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was still unfinished. "Are you all right, son?" she asked suddenly, noticing his stillness. Her voice was gentle, maternal, with an undertone of concern. Daniel forced a breath, nodding quickly. "Yes, ma'am, just lost in thought. We'll be on our way." He turned the key, and the engine's hum filled the silence. The taxi began to roll forward, but Daniel's heart felt as if it were driving backward, retracing old roads of memory. He remembered the laughter of his wife echoing through summer nights, the way she had once spoken of her childhood home with such fondness. She had always wanted him to visit it with her, to sit with her mother in that warm kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon tea. But he had been too busy then, too wrapped in the rush of life. And when death came suddenly, cruelly, that chance had vanished. Now, here he was, steering toward that very house, carrying a woman who might know more about his past than he dared admit. Every street lamp they passed seemed to cast not just light but memory. Daniel's chest ached, his pulse quickened, and his mind swirled with questions he was afraid to ask. Who was she, really? Why had she been at the cemetery? What would he find at the end of this ride? The woman sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets. She seemed lost in her own world of remembrance, occasionally adjusting the flowers in her lap as if they carried the last remnants of someone she cherished. Her silence was not cold but sacred, a silence that spoke louder than words. Daniel found himself wanting to break it, to ask about the person she had been visiting, but the lump in his throat kept him quiet. The drive stretched on, every turn pulling him deeper into the unknown. The address echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. He tried to steady himself with the rhythm of the wipers clearing the windshield, the faint hum of the tires against wet pavement, but nothing eased the storm inside. He felt as though he was being guided by something larger than himself, something that had chosen this exact moment to bring him face to face with his past. By the time the house began to take shape in the distance, Daniel's palms were damp against the steering wheel. He slowed, his breath uneven. The outline of the old home loomed, familiar yet foreign, like a dream resurrected. He wasn't ready for what waited there, yet he couldn't turn back. Fate had already decided. The elderly woman shifted slightly, peering out the window with a look of quiet longing. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a smile that carried both pain and love. In that moment, Daniel realized this ride was no accident. It was a journey not just across town but across time, a bridge between grief and something he didn't yet understand. He pulled the taxi to the curb, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman clutched her flowers tighter, preparing herself to step out. Daniel sat frozen for a second longer, staring at the house, his past reflected in every brick, every shadow. And though his face had gone pale, though his heart trembled with memories long buried, he knew this was the beginning of something he had been avoiding for far too long. The drive had ended, but Daniel felt as though his journey was only beginning. He sat still behind the wheel, staring at the familiar yet distant house, while the elderly woman slowly opened the door. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as if she were carrying more than just her body out of the cab. She was carrying the weight of memories, of years lived and loved. She turned back toward him with a kind smile. "Would you mind helping me with these flowers, son?" she asked softly. Daniel hurried to her side, his hands almost trembling as he took the bouquet from her. Up close, he noticed how frail she really was, her frame small against the oversized coat, her hands shaking slightly in the evening air. He offered his arm, and she accepted it without hesitation, leaning on him for support as they made their way up the path. With every step closer to the door, Daniel's heart pounded harder. The memories of his wife whispered in his ears, her laughter, her warmth, the way she had once described this very path as the one that led her home. The woman unlocked the door with a quiet creak, and the house greeted them with the scent of old wood and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon and tea leaves, just as Daniel's wife had said. Inside, the living room was modest but full of life. Shelves lined with photo frames, a knitted blanket draped over a worn armchair, and little trinkets that spoke of years gone by. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting to the walls where photographs hung in neat rows. "Please, sit down," the woman said gently, motioning to the couch. "I don't often have visitors these days. Let me make us some tea." Daniel tried to speak, to explain the storm raging inside him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, setting the flowers carefully on the small table in the corner. His eyes were drawn to one particular photograph on the wall, a smiling young woman with bright eyes and a laugh that seemed alive even in stillness. His breath caught. It was her, his wife, much younger, standing beside the very woman who had invited him in. He sat down heavily, his heart racing. The clinking of cups and the soft hum of a kettle came from the kitchen, grounding him in the present, yet his mind swam with memories. He remembered his wife telling him she wished he could meet her mother properly one day, to sit together at her kitchen table and listen to stories of her childhood. But life had swept them up, and death had stolen that chance before it ever came. And now, by some strange twist of fate, here he was. The woman returned with a tray, her hands steady despite her age. She placed the cups down and sat across from him, her kind eyes studying him as if she sensed there was more to this meeting than chance. She stirred her tea slowly before speaking. "I go to the cemetery every week," she said softly. "I sit by his grave, my husband, and I tell him about my days. It keeps me from feeling too alone." Her gaze dropped to the flowers resting nearby. "It gets harder, though. The house feels too quiet now." Daniel's chest tightened. He heard the echo of his own loneliness in her words, the silence that had followed him since his wife's passing. He swallowed hard, unable to hold back the tremor in his voice. I know that silence," he admitted. "I lost someone too, someone who meant everything." The woman looked at him with deep understanding, her eyes shimmering. "Loss has a way of bringing strangers together, doesn't it?" she said gently. Daniel hesitated, then glanced again at the photograph on the wall. He pointed with a shaking hand. "That woman, he whispered. Your daughter, what was her name? The old woman followed his gaze. Her lips trembled into a smile filled with both pride and sorrow. Emily, she said softly. My sweet Emily. She was the light of my life. She's been gone for years now. The name hit Daniel like a wave. His vision blurred as he struggled to breathe. He set his cup down, his hands trembling. Emily was my wife, he said hoarsely, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I was married to her. I loved her more than life itself. The silence that followed was thick, almost sacred. The old woman's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her wrinkled cheeks as she reached across the table and took his hand. My son, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. All these years, and I never knew. You've been carrying this pain alone, just as I have. Daniel's tears came freely now, the dam of grief breaking after years of being held back. He gripped her hand tightly, the warmth of her touch seeping into the cold places of his heart. They sat together, crying not just for what they had lost, but for the years they had spent apart, unaware that the bond of family still tied them together. Minutes passed, though it felt like time had stilled. When their tears finally subsided, the woman smiled faintly through her sorrow. You don't have to be alone anymore. This house, it's still her home. And now, it can be yours too, if you wish. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the photos, the memories of Emily woven into every corner. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest felt lighter, as though sharing it had made it bearable. He realized then that kindness had guided him to this moment, that stopping for a lonely woman at the cemetery had brought him back to a family he thought he had lost forever. He nodded, his voice steady but tender. Thank you. I think Emily would have wanted this, first to find each other. The woman squeezed his hand, her smile warm despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. She would, she whispered. That night, as they shared tea and stories deep into the hours, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The crushing weight of grief had given way to connection, to belonging, to healing. It wasn't the end of his journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where sorrow and love could coexist, and where hope could bloom even in the shadow of loss. Sometimes, he thought as he left the house hours later with the promise of returning soon, kindness isn't just about helping a stranger. Sometimes it's the hand that leads you back home, to love you thought you'd lost forever.